Well, it's really a pleasure to welcome you to SOAS and to the Brunei Lecture Theatre. So thank you for being here.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Georgie.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having us.
And I'd love it if you could tell the audience a little bit more about yourselves and introduce your music form.
Well, I was born at a very young age, many weeks ago, in Cardiff, in a Jewish family. Searched for a style of music to play all my life, and one day I heard klezmer on the radio. I was probably in my early 20s, and decided that was the way forwards. And the rest is a very short but beautiful history.
I was growing up in Soviet Union, and when I was 16 I discovered that I had a Jewish surname, so I started asking questions. What does this mean? Because we were all Soviet citizens.
Okay.
So that's how I started to search for my identity. And in the Soviet passport we used to have this fifth line where we would put our ethnic background.
Okay.
So I had choice to put Russian or Jewish. So I started asking questions, and then I was just lucky to live in Kazan, where we had the capital city of Tatarstan, a republic within Russia, central Russia, where we had a klezmer band, one of the first bands since Perestroika. So I went and listened to the concerts. I thought, well, I want to do this.
Wow, I bet.
So it all started then, and here we are, and that's how I met Merlin.
So what about that story? Yeah, how did you guys met through music?
Yeah.
I'd like to add something to what Polina said about identity and music. It's very, very interesting, but one of the main draws of klezmer music, particularly to Jewish people, is to secular Jewish people. People are finding their roots, and people are kind of identifying with the music rather than with going to a prayer and a kind of... The synagogue, to me at any rate, as a child, and every time I'd been as a child, it offered a very gender-based hierarchy. Right. And I didn't like that, but I loved the music. And I think for a lot of people playing Jewish music, it's really is a way in. A lot of secular Jews, non-religious Jews, they find their way back to their culture, and they find the beautiful sides of Judaism, which is, the music's fantastic. But a lot of the other stuff, to my way of seeing the world, isn't. That doesn't mean people can't get stuff out of it, but for me, it's this is more interesting.
And could you tell us a little bit more about this this first collection of songs? Because this is a wedding.
Oh, the song cycle that we played.
Song cycle, yeah.
It's called Dihasana. It's a cycle of poems by Moshe Kulbek, whom I consider the most depressive Yiddish poet. This was written in the 1920s, 30s, when he lived in Germany, and at that time, as we know, things were happening that weren't so positive, but also there was this new folk, neo-folk movement, and he wrote these poems exactly in the style of folk poetry. But guess what? It's a happy Jewish wedding where it's not a forced arranged marriage. It's actually they love each other, and it's a rich house. There's lots of beautiful food on the table. Guests are arriving bringing homemade jams and ducks and stuff, and life is beautiful, and they love each other, and they even caress each other's hand. And how dare you do it? People can see it, but they love each other. So I just love the ring of it. So the music that I composed is partly traditional with some twists, but I love that combination.
And having a cycle like this where one song moves into the next, is that part of the tradition, or is that something you've added?
Yeah, it's because his poems go one into the next one. I thought that would work for the vocal cycle as well.
The original. Yeah. Okay, and then so that kind of leads me to talk a bit about the next project, which was the translation of Stencl poems into music. Could you tell us a bit more about that project?
Yeah. Well, a couple of years ago, a friend of mine who is a Yiddish translator and interpreter, Asif Roman, who lives in Kharkov in Ukraine, sent me a few poems. I'm always in search for new poems for my songs. And amongst these poems, there was a Stencl poem, Die Veler, which is one of the songs. And I thought that's nice. I like the meaning. I like the language. And it was also written in the 1920s in Leipzig or in Berlin, certainly in Germany when he lived there. And so I knew the name. I didn't know much about the poet, but I knew that he later moved to Britain. And then it came from you, it came from you. Why not write another song? And the later poetry, the poetry that was written in Britain, is much more complex, much more, the words are beautiful. There's a lot of symbolism. There is a lot of hidden meanings, and you can read one thing, another thing into these poems. Quite difficult to write music to, because there is no rhyme, there is no rhythm.
Right. So
it's almost like speech, but with lots of different beautiful imagery. So yeah, the second poem was Halbe Levone, which is half moon, and I make references to the Moon Sonata, Beethoven. So I thought that was a good connection between something Yiddish-lach, there is a bit of Yiddish mode there, and classical, because he was also kind of almost a classical poet.
Well, it sounds absolutely beautiful. So you've done a lot with something that obviously was quite difficult and scanned quite, awkwardly. But it was So tell us a bit more about the composition sort of process. You look at the words and then you become inspired by a sort of sound that you hear, or do you decide to kind of come from the musical side and then start putting the words to it?
No, it's always reading and reading and reading, and then reading with piano and trying to put some chords and bits of melody to the poem as I'm reading it.
Yeah.
And it's more about the energy of the poem, just the general. Once I've caught it, I can just then write the rest of the song. But it's like this, where do I take it? Is it quiet? Is it meditative? Or is it active and energetic? And do I want it to be in 3, or do I want it to be in 5, or do I want it to be in 8? Plus, I like to use a little bit of Jewish elements, something recognizably Jewish. So a little bit of modal, some twists that would be, give that flavor.
Yeah. Oh, it's come out really, really beautifully. And we're very lucky now at SOAS, because we're going to have these 2 songs, these original compositions, in our archive as part of the Stencl poetry collection.
I'm proud.
We're proud. That's lovely. So the other pieces that you've been playing this evening are traditional pieces where you improvise on the stage as you're playing.
It's people often refer to klezmer as Jewish jazz, but it's not.
Okay.
It really isn't. Klezmer music, as discussed, is a traditional dance music, and the style of improvisation within it is absolutely tiny. Whereas in jazz you have melodic improvisation in earlier jazz, and then as jazz developed, the improvisation became vertical, meaning harmonic. So the players would improvise over harmony and use the chords rather than the melody as their jumping off point. Whereas in klezmer music, the improvisation is actually closer to interpretation, and it's more about ornamentation and phrasing.
Right.
So the melody generally stays intact.
Mm-hmm. So you don't give each other too many surprises.
No.
Well, we do.
We do, but that's just for our own entertainment, not
keep each other on your toes.
But the melodies tend to unfold as the melodies were originally written. You can embellish, you can rephrase, you can put in little runs of notes, but really it's a micro improvisation.
And where do you learn these songs from? Do you teach them do you learn them from other musicians, or do they come from sheet music that you have access to?
A bit of both, but primarily I think learning style, you have to go to old recordings. And if you listen to the really old recordings, then the ornamentation and the phrasing come in, they get into your blood, they get under your skin, so that when you eventually get to look at a tune on a piece of paper, you'll know how it should be ornamented and how it should be phrased without having to...
Mm-hmm. And you said that recently more of these kind of archives have become available to you?
There have recently been some pretty big chunks of early transcriptions. They've been digitized and put online, so now we all have access to quite a big wealth of new stuff.
Great.
Quite a lot of it is same as the old stuff, and also, this is only my opinion, so whether it's valid as truth or not, I don't know, but some of the songs, some of the tunes from this archive, the Kizilov archive, and some of the tunes from another archive, the Berekovsky archive, are the same, and slightly different variations of them. But I think there's a lot of stuff that's not really that interesting in them. There's a lot of tunes, there are many tunes that haven't survived in the repertoire because they're actually not that interesting.
Okay.
But there are a handful of tunes that are fabulous, and
Yeah.
some of them are in both archives. So
They stood the test of time.
stood the test of time, and also stood the test of geography,
Right.
because they were taken from quite a large geographical area
Yeah.
and all put into one lump.
In fact, that's something I wanted to ask about, was across the geography of Yiddish music, klezmer, are there large stylistic differences, or is it held together by a kind of overall style?
That's a deep question. A lot of the original input into klezmer music was Hasidic nigunim,
Right.
and each region of Hasidim would have a slightly different way of presenting their songs and their wordless prayers, which are the nigunim. And from one, you can tell from which ones come from which dynasties.
Okay.
So there is the ornamentation tends to be the same. The ornamentation, or at least very similar. So ornamentation from Kiev might be very, very similar to ornamentation from Kishinev.
Okay. But you couldn't be like, oh, that's a Kiev sound, or you've...
I think I think people can.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think people can, and I think people really can tell musical structures. But underneath all that, there is a core ornamentation and phrasing style,
Right.
and a vocal production style, and a instrumentation sound.
Yeah.
You know, there's a sound that people made on instruments 100 years ago that they don't really make on instruments anymore. There became, I think, around the late 30s, actually a bit later, early 40s, when the three big record labels, and Norman Lebrecht has written a book on this about opera, when the three big record labels standardized how music should be, all this regional variation went out of music. And I think a lot of these styles and a lot of these things are only captured now on shellac recordings and cylinders.
Okay. Yeah.
And anything that came later than 1948 is going to be standardized.
And your sound, given your very disparate sort of backgrounds? The special...
I don't know, because I actually learned... I didn't really have a Jewish music background, klezmer music background back in the Soviet Union. The way that people started playing Yiddish music in former Soviet Union was quite shallow, because we'd lost the tradition. So we actually learned it all from these guys. Merlin was one of the teachers who brought it back to former Soviet Union.
Okay, wow.
So now because it's been a couple of 2-3 decades almost since it came back, and there's like a so-called revival of this music.
Yeah.
Former Soviet Union, Europe, America's for longer. These cultures have gone in slightly different directions. So the new klezmorim, new players of this music in former Soviet Union, play it closer to how they like it.
Okay.
Right? So it's a bit more of a popular style. Some of them are real traditionalists. And we have people in America playing it American style. And then we have, all these different styles, whichever, yeah.
And it kind of gives, it's very positive, because it kind of gives an indication that a culture is still alive.
Yeah.
If it's
Still
different,
morphing.
if it's different wherever it lands.
Right.
If it lands in America and the Americans add an American thing to it, then it shows a living culture. And that's a very positive thought.
Yeah.
Whether or not one likes the American style or whether or not one likes the Soviet style is another question.
Sure.
And has to fall outside of the argument. It's not really
Right.
valid.
No, we like it's life
Yeah.
and
it's-
vivacity.
Yeah.
Good. I wanted to ask you a bit more about your engagement with the sort of UK Yiddish music scene, because when I started talking to Polina about this Stencl project, she pointed out some really interesting connections that you had personally with friends of Stencl.
I was a friend of Meyer Bogdansky's. I don't know if you've come across him. He was an amazing... He was in his late 90s when he died, and he came from Pietrków in Poland. He settled in London, I think, when he was 50. He survived the war. His wife didn't survive. he came to Britain, and he had so much going on in his head, so much poetry and so much music, that he decided, age 54, he had to learn to play music so he could write it all down. And one of the he was the president of London Friends of Yiddish for many, many years. And one of the people who was also a member of the group was Stencl.
Right.
So they became good friends. And I believe that Bogdansky set a lot of Stencl's poems to music, to his own music. And he pointed me in the direction of YIVO in New York and said, all my stuff's there. I gave it all to YIVO, and if you want it, unfortunately I don't have it in my flat anymore, but here's what I have, and gave me a load of stuff that he did have. But YIVO have all of his songs, and I believe that many of the words are Stencl's poetry.
How interesting.
But I never met Stencl. He was already dead by the time I knew Bogdansky.
Okay. Oh, well, that's definitely a path to go down, to sort of listen to some more of those recordings. Well, thank you so much for coming in. It's been really wonderful working with you both and listening to your gorgeous music this evening. So I look forward to inviting you back and talking more and working further on these kind of questions.
And thanks very much for supporting this culture and us musicians and carrying the flag of Yiddish culture further.
Thank you very
Pleasure.
much.